So thanks everybody for joining us today. We had a great response to the Steelhead project this year, last year, I should say. And it wouldn't have been possible without the mass marking program led by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Right now, we're lucky to have Matt Cornish joining in with us today. Matt gave a nice presentation at one of our meetings last year to go over some preliminary results. But I wanted to do a quick reminder and have Matt join in today. Reminder that everything that's been stocked since 2018 has had an ad clip in Michigan. So all the yearling steelhead that have gone in since 2018 have the ad clip. So your returning lake age 2, 3, and 4 steelhead will be marked for the upcoming season. And most of you are probably aware that there is a missing stocked 2021 year class in Michigan waters because eggs were not taken during 2020 because of the pandemic. So those fish that would have been stocked in 2021 would be the skippers returning now. So it probably won't make a huge difference to the fishery just yet. And Matt has a couple slides here to go through. If you want to take the mic, Matt.
Sure, thanks, Dan. So I don't want to take up too much of the meeting's time, but I just wanted to provide a quick overview of what we're hoping to do with the steelhead mass marking study. So Dan gave a nice intro to that. As he said, every steelhead stocked in the Lake Michigan has been AD clipped starting in 2018, and that's with the 2017 year class of steelhead. Most of those fish also have coded wire tags, which provide information on the stocking location, the year, which helps us calculate the age, the genetic strain, and other key information. That'll be helpful in achieving some of our study objectives. In addition to the tagging, our program also sponsors a large field program that collects data on adult fish caught by anglers. So to any anglers in the audience today, thank you very much for potentially interacting with our technicians at cleaning stations and at tournaments. We would not be able to have any data whatsoever without the voluntary participation of anglers. So that is a key asset for this study. The objectives we're hoping to get at least a handful of them, include similar objectives that we've tackled for Chinook salmon and for lake trout. We want to estimate wild recruitment by looking not only at the fish that are marked, but the fish that are not marked, which at this point, the vast majority of unmarked steelhead in Lake Michigan will be wild. As Dan mentioned, there's very few fish that are age 5 and older. And at this point, every fish age 4 or younger, those cohorts are the mass marked cohorts, with the exception of the 2020 year class, but we don't see a lot of age 1 fish. So this particular year might be a good one for trying to get a solid estimate on wild recruitment. We also hoping to describe movement within Lake Michigan and between Lake Michigan and other lakes. Determine factors that affect survival to maximize return on investment. Some of these factors could include the stocking location, genetic strain, and the size of stocking. And then to also describe growth and maturity rates, which could be useful for population dynamic models. So in terms of what we've actually done on this project so far, in 2019, we collected 1,156 steelhead. This included 176 fish that had tags. Most of those were from that first year class, the 2017 year class. Those were age 2 in 2019. In 2020, we didn't have a field season, unfortunately, due to the restrictions regarding coronavirus. We were back out in the field in 2021. And so through September 1st of this year, we have observations on 755 steelhead, including 345 with tags. One thing I attempted to do this afternoon was a very quick and dirty kind of back of the envelope calculation for percent wild. So I looked at the average length at age of steelhead from all years of past data, and the average length of an age 4 steelhead is 685 millimeters. So that's about 27 and a half inches. So what I did for 2021, thinking that, we have a pretty solid understanding that age 4 and younger fish that without a clip are probably wild. I can tell you the percentage of rainbow trout 700 millimeters or less in 2021 that were unclipped were 34%. So that's take that with a grain of salt. It is consistent with another study that we're involved in that's being led from Central Michigan University and MSU and Michigan DNR that's looking at the otolith microchemistry. That particular effort has estimated that wild recruitment is somewhere between 20 and 45% in terms of the proportion of the population out there. And so 34% is definitely consistent with that. So again, take with a grain of salt, but we're looking at potentially about a third of that population being comprised of wild fish. Dan, you can go ahead and go on to the next slide. So I just have one more slide for folks today, and I think it might have been presented at last year's meeting, but it is basically preliminary findings that are indicating that steelhead likely have lake-wide movements similar to what we've seen for Chinook salmon, where the stocking location doesn't necessarily affect the harvest location during the open water season. Obviously, during spawning runs, it's a different story. It's likely these fish home to where they were stocked, similar to Chinook. Something we hope to get at once we start getting those weir data in. But what we're looking at here, this is data from 2019. So these are 2-year-old steelhead from the 2017 year class. The yellow shaded areas represent the harvest locations in each map, and then the pink circles represent the stocking locations. So the map on the left is showing that fish that were harvested in WM4, that's a region of Wisconsin that includes Manitowoc and Sheboygan. So all the fish, all the steelhead that were harvested in that yellow polygon were stocked all over the lake. And that's what we see with those pink circles from, northern Lake Michigan, southern Lake Michigan, both shorelines. And then we see a similar pattern for WM5, which is the area near Milwaukee and Kenosha. The reason we focused on these two areas is because in 2019, I think about half of the samples that we had with tag data were collected in those two units. And so we didn't feel like we had the sample size necessary to look at, say, what's going on in Michigan waters. I think that'll change with the data from 2021. So what I would predict would happen based on experience with Chinook and the similarity here is that we'll see similar patterns on the Michigan shoreline where fish are being recovered from all sorts of different stocking locations. But at this point, that's just a hypothesis. And, we should have some data analyzed by this winter from the 2021 season where we can start getting a better handle on some of these questions. So that's all I had for a mass marking update. Dan, thanks for letting me have a few minutes here. I'll thank you.
Thanks a lot, Matt. Appreciate you chiming in and joining us today. I will mention that people collected about 40 heads last year based on our survey. We asked how many our own volunteers collected, and that was great. Great to see. More would be wonderful for the next year because, as Matt mentioned, if we're not collecting them voluntarily out in the rivers, then there's not really a network of agency biologists in a lot of these areas, unless there's a weir on the river. So there is a $100 prize drawing. A bunch of businesses and Great Lakes Salmon Initiative have organized 33 prizes for people who drop off heads and register. So if you're interested in that, prize drawing cutoff day is November 1st. And I expect they'll probably continue that next year, but that's kind of the deadline for this year's submissions. Another little quick recap of the Steelhead program in general. All that we're asking people to do is register at the GL Angler Diary site or download one of the apps and record every river fishing trip that targets steelhead. And that includes skunk trips. This is something that we had pretty good follow through on last year, but there were a couple of people who were confused on that and only recorded trips where steelhead were actually caught. So the cutoff is if you are targeting steelhead, if you have a reasonable expectation of catching steelhead, then count that trip because we look at the effort as well as the catch. Also measure each and every steelhead caught and check for fin clips and other marks. We expanded the categories for estimating lengths this year a little bit, and I'll talk more about that later. A couple other things that are new for this year. We have the new Android app now available. So that's great. That just happened this week. You should be able to get the Android app now in the Google Play Store if you just search for GL Angler Diary. There's a new iOS update that's pending final approval of the privacy policy and should be up any minute now. We've added a couple locations based on input from you. So it's always great when people say, hey, I fish these areas and we'd like to include those. So let us know if you have additional ones. There were some problems with photo uploads on geoanglerdiary.org, and those have been fixed. So another thing that we have for this year is some promotional products. One thing that people brought up last year is it would be great to have something that people could give to other folks on the river. So we have this data log on waterproof Right in the Rain paper that we came up with. It has all the instructions in there and a few data sheets. The idea is not to have people filling out the data and actually mailing these to us. Rather, it's just a quick way to record data on the river, and then it tells you how to enter the data online. And hopefully it's something that you can put into people's hands to kind of promote the project. We also have measuring tapes and pencils available. So with these, we'll be trying to make the rounds and actually hand these out to all of you, our agency partners and team leaders for local distribution in the next month or so. And we may also do some mailings if we can't make it around to everyone in person. Also, I want to remind everyone we have this great resource page on the Sea Grant website, and we put all the new results there. So there's a new article on our percent clipped findings from this year that I'll go through in a minute. There's all the survey answers from survey that people took at the end of last season. And we also have an inland guide survey that's just been posted up there. So remember to check in if you want the latest results, they'll be there. So now I'll go through the results of our survey and data collection from last season. So everything from here forward refers to this time period from October 1st, 2020 to May 31st, 2021. And we had 85 data sets collected in terms of the surveys filled out. And we found that volunteers filled out the survey came from all these areas shown on the screen, mostly from Lake Michigan with 68 listing home water in Lake Michigan, 5 in the Lake Huron Basin, 3 in Lake Erie St. Clair Basin, and 8 in the Clinton or Huron River. So if you look at the complete data sets that were actually entered into Great Lakes Angler Diary, it looks a little bit different since some of the people who filled out the survey didn't necessarily record complete data throughout the course of the year. But we did get 49 complete data sets for steelhead, which was great. We also had several for other species, but we're going to concentrate on the steelhead today. We asked about how many trips people took, and we had a couple ways of looking at this. First, we asked all the survey respondents. So even if you didn't have complete data recorded in Great Lakes Angler Diary, we still asked how many trips did you take and how many trips did you actually catch steelhead. So we had this range of 0 to 110 trips from survey respondents, and it wound up to about a 44% rate of skunk trips. And it was interesting because we could take that and then cross-reference it with what we actually got in the Great Lakes Angler Diary reporting system. And we found that they had a slightly lower percentage of skunk trips with our complete data sets. And to make things a little more confusing, as I'm going through this, we really have 3 data sets we're considering here. We have the complete effort data, where we have these 43 folks who really demonstrated that they recorded all of their skunk trips and all of their catches. And then we had 49 people who recorded all of their catches. 6 of them didn't record all of their effort data. So that's important in how we use it, because we couldn't use complete catch data sets for catch rate computations unless we knew that we had complete effort data too. So another thing we looked at, regardless of whether you had a complete data set in GL Angler Diary, was satisfaction. So we asked a series of questions that people were asked to agree with or disagree with. And we have this 5-point scale that goes from strongly disagree at 1 to strongly agree at 5. So I color coded these up there, and they're all kind of in the middle. That lukewarm area might get pushed into a little bit, but angler satisfaction was generally kind of this year. If you looked at the second question, I was satisfied with my fishing experiences overall. That pertains not specifically to steelhead, but just fishing in general, and that was a little bit higher. But when you look specifically at questions about steelhead fishing this year versus the past 5 years on my home water, or the past year on my home water, you saw lower values. So I think it's fair to say that fishing overall it wasn't fantastic last year, but it wasn't horrible either. So when we get into the data from the Great Lakes Angler Diary, here we have the lengths of fish by Great Lakes Basin. So Lake Michigan's on the left, Lake Huron in the middle, Lake Erie, which was really just the Clinton River. That was the only tributary of Lake Erie we got a lot of results from. So we separated this out and we looked at the length of steelhead on the x-axis. So those are the numbers from 0 to 35. Those are the lengths of steelhead in inches. And then the height of the bar shows how many steelhead were in that length group. So you see that these curves all look a little bit different. And another way to think about this would just be the average length of the fish. And it looks like those are different too, right? For Lake Michigan, you tend to see more fish to the right of the curve in that 30 to 35 inch range than you do in the other curves. And you also see that the average length is close to 26 inches. And then contrast that over to the Clinton River, the average length was only 23 inches. So as biologists, we always want to try to explain that, right? Is that because the fish are growing more quickly in Lake Michigan? Or is there a difference where we have more old fish in Lake Michigan and more young fish in the Clinton River? We can't really say that until we have a lot better understanding of exactly how the fish grow, and data like that we can't really get at with this particular program. But hopefully we can put together our data sets with others down the road and construct a kind of an age length key that gives us better information on that. But for now, we can say some interesting things, right? From an angling perspective, Lake Michigan anglers are probably more likely to catch 30-inch plus fish than folks in the Clinton River. In fact, 22% of fish caught in Lake Michigan were over that 30-inch mark, with only 2% in Lake Huron and less than 1% in Lake Erie being above 30 inches. So that's kind of a substantial difference when you're talking about the prevalence of large steelhead in those tributaries. And again, when I say Lake Michigan Basin, this is only fish caught in tributaries of Lake Michigan, not fish caught in the Great Lakes themselves. So if we take a closer look at specific rivers, or specific watersheds, I should say, because this would include the St. Joseph River and its tributaries, the Grand River and its tributaries, and the Kalamazoo River and its tributaries. We see again that there seems to be a slight difference in the average length, but it's a little bit more subtle here when we look from river to river within the basin. And if you look at the percentage over 30 inches, again, it kind of jumps out. It seems like the St. Joe River is producing a lot more of those fish over 30 inches relative to the Grand, and certainly the Kalamazoo, where only 10% are over that 30-inch mark. Of course, part of this too, you have to look at that sample size, and that's given up there by the N value. So the more fish we have, the more confidence we can really make conclusions with. If you look at northern Lake Michigan watersheds and the Betsy River watershed, we had an average length of 25.7 inches, 25.8, virtually the same in the Manistee. And then the Pere Marquette was interesting. And I wanted to put this up and kind of explain it, because this shows why it's important to really measure the fish as opposed to estimating them when you can. Because in the Pere Marquette River, we have this finding that looks like there are a lot of large fish in the PM, right? The average is larger, and then the percentage over 30 inches is 25%, which is double what you see in the Manistee. But we also had a lot of fish that were estimated. So what it looked like is the fish that were measured precisely tended to be larger fish, because people who caught a large fish were more likely to be interested in measuring them and finding out exactly how big they were. And the nice thing is we also had the estimated lengths for all the fish from those same volunteers that were estimated. So when we break down the estimated value, now we see the N value goes from 68 fish that were precisely measured, goes up to 168 when we include all the fish that were estimated. So now we have a kind of a different looking curve. And in fact, it is a little bit more similar to what we see in the Manistee River and the Betsy River, although it is still different. When we did run statistics on this, and the curve for the Pere Marquette was significantly different than the Betsy. So we see fewer smaller fish in that 15 to 19 inch range for the PM, and slightly more mid-sized and large fish in the PM versus the Betsy. And the Manistee River is somewhere in between and not significantly different than either of the others. So another thing we can look at, and this is just for Lake Michigan, stream caught steelhead. We looked at the length frequencies for clipped versus unclipped steelhead. And again, you can kind of look at those length frequency histograms and see that some differences do jump out. The average lengths are very similar. The percentage over 30 inches is pretty similar as well, but you do kind of see an odd peak in the clipped fish. And this lower end of the length frequency distribution here, those would have been fish that were stocked in 2020. So those would have been returning skippers between 15 and 20 inches long. And what kind of jumps out to me is that there's that really high bar there around 17 inches. So that may be because those fish had less variation in growth, and coming out of a hatchery situation, you might expect that because fish are all produced at kind of the same size. Whereas with the wild fish, you have some fish that mature after 1 year in the stream, some that mature after 2 years in the stream. So there's some variation in their head start on growth as well. But one of the things that's really interesting here is this was the 2020 stocking. And remember, we mentioned earlier, there was no stocking in 2021. So this gives us maybe a little prelude to what we might expect for next year. Another thing I wanted to put up here was the average length and age from an old study on the Manistee River, just so you can get kind of a feeling for how these lengths might correspond to different ages. So for sure, that first peak that you see there circled, those are going to be almost all age 1 fish that averaged about 17.4 inches in this little Manistee study. Your age 2 fish are probably around 25 inches. But you start getting a lot of overlap between those lake age 2 fish, lake age 3 fish, and then a ton of overlap when you go from 3 to 4, and then even higher to 5 and 6. In fact, the 5 and 6s really aren't necessarily going to be much bigger than the age 4s. Those are all going to be repeat spawners by that time, which means they're putting more of their resources into maturing and spawning than growth as well. So it's not necessarily a valid conclusion if you say, well, those age 5 and 6 fish must be the biggest ones out there. So it doesn't always hold up that way. So here's an example from a data set we had on salmon in Lake Michigan from the Salmon Ambassadors Program. And this is kind of what we hope we don't see with this missing year class of steelhead. So for a quick explanation here, we have the same kind of length frequency histogram, and the 2013 year class in 2014, when we made this graph from salmon caught by volunteers in Lake Michigan, we had a fair number of fish right there, but pretty low in that 2013 year class. So those were fish less than 20 inches. They would have been age 1 in 2014. And then you see the older fish in that 20 to 30 inch range. You see that curve is much higher, and 30 plus, you still have a large portion of the curve there. But what happened is the next year, 2015, looked completely different. And if you remember what was going on in 2013, there were stocking cuts. Chinook stocking was cut by about 50%. As it turned out, natural reproduction also went down by about 80% in 2013. So it was a huge difference between the 2014 year class and the 2013 year class. And what we saw is the curve completely changed in 2015. As that 2013 year class matured, those fish got older and larger. You saw this loss of fish in the middle. And those are the fish that really contribute a lot to the fishery. So what we're hoping we don't see in the steelhead program this year is a similar kind of cutting out of the middle. So quick word on the different types of marks that were recorded by our volunteers. The vast majority were just adipose fin clip, but we asked people to look for all different kinds of fin clips. If the fish were missing a ventral fin or pectoral fin, it's important to know which side of the fish the paired fins were cut, and also check for maxilla marks, because some of the fish in Wisconsin have either the right or left maxilla, that upper jawbone, clipped as well. And again, the vast majority of the fish were just adipose fin clipped. But we did have one fish with a left maxilla caught. And I thought this was really interesting to point out, because we only had 7 fish returned from Wisconsin volunteers, and one of them had that left maxilla clip. We had 1,369 fish taken from Michigan, and none of them showed that particular Wisconsin clip. So it was a little different when you looked at the adipose left ventral combination. That's another mark that was only used in Wisconsin. In 2017, it was used to mark the Ganaraska Normandale strain of steelhead that were stocked in 2017. And one of those fish did show up in the Little Manistee River. And we also got another one returned from Wisconsin River. So you can see that, in general, we had very few fish that we knew were from Wisconsin showing up in Michigan rivers. We also had a few marks that I'm not quite sure what to make of, and maybe other people can comment on that if they were your fish. But we had one fish with a dorsal fin clip noted in the Kalamazoo, one with a left pectoral, left ventral combination in the St. Joe, and another one with a right pec clip in the St. Joe. And these don't match up with anything in the Great Lakes fish stocking database that I saw. So I'm not sure if those were marks that strayed in from somewhere I'm not aware of, or if maybe these were fish that had an injury that looked like a fin clip and was recorded as such. But I will note that those fish did not have any kind of adipose fin clip noted at all. So when we talk about percent clipped in the next few slides, that's just percent adipose fin clip. So we know those were clipped after the mask marking program began. And as you can see, there's a huge variation from one watershed to the other. We have a great variation from the Pere Marquette, which had extremely low percent clipped, around 2%, up to the Black River, which had 94% clipped. So real variation in how the stocked fish are contributing to different fisheries. And some of these might come as a surprise to you. Some of them have a pretty even balance. Rivers like the Kalamazoo, Manistee, and Muskegon have a pretty good balance of wild and stocked fish. St. Joe, the Grand had a lot of wild fish. Now, remember that our volunteers are mostly in the upper ends of all these watersheds this year, which we're trying to change. We'd like to really promote people in lower rivers participating more, but in the Grand and the Upper Grand in particular, and tributaries like Prairie Creek, you really see a high percent wild that's right on par with the Betsy River. The White River, we had lower returns, but it looks like a very high percent wild there too. One thing I want to note is the error bars are 95% confidence intervals. So what this means is we're 95% sure that the actual percent clipped is somewhere between the upper end and lower end of the bar. And this really illustrates why it's important to get good numbers of returns. So you see rivers that have a really high N or number of fish returned, like the Betsy, we had 213 fish returned, and we have a pretty narrow confidence interval. Other rivers, we have fewer fish returned, like the White, and with 17 fish returned, we have a pretty wide confidence interval that goes from about 1 up to about 27%. So it's a fairly wide range. Another thing to note is that as you get to really low percent clipped or really high percent clipped, you also have a narrowing of that confidence interval. So the ones that are right in between 50-50 split, it takes an even higher number of fish returned to really look at significant differences from one watershed to the next. So then we can look at a couple of these where we had a high enough return in the main river and a tributary to look at some differences. And one that jumped out as being really interesting was the Au Sable, where Van Etten Creek had a very low percent clipped, and the Ossabaw River had more of a 50-50 kind of split. So this was a significant difference. You can see those error bars don't overlap at all. Van Etten's definitely cranking out more wild fish, or at least we should say the wild fish are contributing more to the Van Etten fishery than they are to the Ossabaw. And then on the Grand watershed, we had Prairie Creek with a very low percentage of clipped fish, and the Upper Grand having a pretty similarly low percentage of clipped fish, probably because those Upper Grand fish are headed to places like Prairie Creek or other tributaries where they can spawn successfully. But we only had a handful of fish return from the Lower Grand. Even so, it looks like the percent clipped is much higher in the Lower Grand. So it would be great to get more confirmation of this, since obviously we have a huge fishery there below 6th Street Dam and lower in the river. And it's looking like that is a lot more driven by stocked fish than the upper river fishery is. So another thing to touch on is catch rates. And this was a little bit more complicated to try to get at, because we had a couple different ways to assess this. First, we asked people, questions that I showed earlier on skunk rates, but then we looked only at the participants who provided complete catch and effort data, and actually had solid, reliable data as best as we could tell. And some people we even emailed and double checked to make sure that these 29 data sets were really representative of all the catch and all the effort. And using this set of data, we found that people averaged 1.3 steelhead caught per trip. And if we look at the number caught per angler hour, that breaks down to about 0.28 steelhead caught per angler hour over the entire state. At average about 0.3 for Lake Michigan, 0.27 for Lake Huron, 0.24 for the Clinton River, and 0.26 for fall, 0.30 for spring season when we broke it down like that. Basically, they're all pretty similar. They're all between one fish every 3 or 4 hours is pretty standard catch rate across the state last year. So this doesn't mean a whole lot yet, but I wanted to put it up here because if we have the same volunteers fishing the same areas for multiple years, it will become very meaningful. The thing is, we know that folks who are swinging flies for steelhead don't really expect the same catch rates that someone might pulling plugs with 3 rods or fishing another way that they're really trying to maximize their harvest. So we don't want to mix and match too much and say, these are volunteers in one river who are fishing one way are equal to those in another. However, if we know that it's all the same people catching fish over a series of years using generally the same techniques, fishing the same waters, then we can say something about the trends in catch per unit effort. And that might prove very useful. If we see, for example, that catch rates start going down, we can put that together with what we have with the length data and the fin clip data and try to make some assessment of whether it's the lack of stocking that's doing it or whether it's trouble with natural reproduction. So it's important to have these. And again, just want to reiterate that if you participated last year, it's really important to participate again and to make sure to include all those skunk trips in case we can really make something with the catch per unit effort in the future. So another way to look at this is linking the trip satisfaction with the catch per unit effort. And this seems like a no-brainer. You catch more fish, you're happier. But it doesn't always hold up quite as nicely as you see here. You see a really nice relationship here where higher catch per unit effort, higher number of steelhead caught per hour, really tracked well with trip satisfaction for our volunteers. And not everyone recorded this. This was kind of a little bonus thing. You had to go to trip information in the glanglerdiary.org site. And then there's a drop-down menu. You click for optional trip information, and there's a box for satisfaction. So we had a 10 or 9-point scale on this one, with 5 being right in the middle, right at neutral. So not a whole lot of people use this, but it turns out it looks really good. So I'd encourage you, if you're interested, if you're willing to, just go in and mark your trip satisfaction this year, because this will be a neat way that we can really link catch rates with fishing satisfaction in the future. So if you look at what this wound up saying, it's 1 fish per 10 hours, or 0.1 steelhead per angler hour, was right about at that neutral point for trip satisfaction. So if people are catching 1 fish per 10 hours, it's kind of so-so. As it goes up to 1 fish per 5 hours, people's satisfaction really starts going up. If it goes below that, satisfaction really starts tailing down. You see at 0, people were down in that very dissatisfied area. So those were the skunk trips people tended to not be very satisfied with, as we'd expect. But it's nice to put numbers to that relationship. And then we can see in the future, again, if catch rates do fall, how will that really affect people's satisfaction and their willingness to come back and keep fishing? Another thing we looked at was the patterns of catch and release. We had a lot of people who did a lot of catch and release, but selectively harvested a few fish, quite a few catch and release only, and a few that keep any that are legal to harvest. So a good mix there, but dominated by people who are selectively harvesting fish. So then we had some questions, and we looked at the data from GL Angler Diary for this, to figure out if people are selectively harvesting females. And the answer was no. The harvest of female versus male fish looked virtually the same. Over 80% of females and over 80% of males are released. And the overall sex ratio, too, of fish that were caught by volunteers is about 50-50. It's 53% males and the rest female. So another question we could ask is, do people selectively harvest stocked versus wild fish? And it did look like people were more likely to release unclipped fish. They were slightly more likely to release the wild or unclipped fish versus clipped fish. So there was some selective harvest going on already. And we asked some additional questions about preferred harvest limits after we had some great discussion with Jay last year on some of our Zoom calls. We know that this is something that people are interested in, but over time, there's never been a really strong consensus from the angling community at large. So we asked questions related to preferred harvest limit. A lot of people preferred 1. If you looked at just an average of these preferred harvest limits, it came out at 1.68 when we asked, what's your preferred harvest limit on most streams? When we asked, what's your preferred limit on your home water, it came out virtually the same at 1.69. And we asked, what's your preferred harvest limit for Great Lakes? It was a little bit higher at 1.89. And that may come from the fact that when we had the discussion last year with Tracy and Jay about how many steelhead are actually caught and harvested in the Great Lakes, it's probably a bit lower than what we're seeing in the rivers. We also did an inland guide survey I mentioned. I'm not going to go through all the results of that, but we asked some of the exact same questions. So here we had 57 steelhead guides. And they had some pretty similar answers. They were a little bit more in favor of the lower limits. Their average for most streams was 1.02 for their preferred harvest limit. And I also found a dissertation from 2005 at U of M that did some modeling to look at what a reduction of steelhead bag limits in rivers in Michigan would actually do in terms of reducing harvest. Because, you know, there's the old adage, if you lower the limit, but no one's catching their limit, it really doesn't do anything. And what he found was that lowering the limit to 2 fish a day would only reduce harvest by about 6%. And again, this was back in 2005, so things may have changed a bit since then. But he did find that lowering the harvest to 1 fish a day could conceivably lower the total amount of fish harvested in streams by about 25%. But again, there's a lot of things that have changed. There's changes in voluntary catch and release, and you know, the models that he would have used then have been updated quite a bit as well. So we asked another question related to release of wild versus stocked steelhead, and people did tend to think that it would lead to increased fitness of steelhead populations, because those wild fish would probably be homing in on the areas that were naturally conducive to their reproduction, because their parents were able to successfully reproduce there if they were able to make it back. So tended to get agreement, but not complete agreement on that. And last question here, we had people rank, and this is very broad in general, but we asked people if they thought their home water would benefit from additional stocking of steelhead, and we tended to get a lot of agreement with that. We also had even more agreement with the statement, my home water would benefit from habitat restoration, and slightly lower, but still pretty strong support overall for the statement, my home water would benefit from reducing the steelhead bag limit. So again, not that those numbers mean a whole lot at this time, but it will be interesting over the next couple of years as we continue this project to see if opinions on these things change, or if there are changes in management that might result in some changes on the ground. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jay Wesley, who's should be on, because Jay was going to chime in here and give a little update on management and kind of a follow-up to some of the harvest limit discussions.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. This is awesome information. So I really appreciate it. We wouldn't have it without the volunteers. So I appreciate all of you for recording your data. I don't have any slides, just a few updates. We were talking about regulation changes, over the winter and spring, and, we're not in a position to suggest any changes at this point, mostly because we're still gathering data. So we've still got this information coming in from the Angler Diary program. We got the info from the surveys that Dan's been doing. The microchemistry data that Jory had presented is almost published, and they're refining some things from that. So we're kind of waiting on that as well. We also just heard of a Steelhead Lake Michigan lake-wide model that Jory has been working on, along with Ben Terzak. And so that's going to provide some more information for us in terms of how the Lake Michigan population is doing. It's a really nice statistical catch at age model. So once we get all that information together, we can start putting at least a biological story together and see where we're at and see whether biologically it makes sense to change regulations. I think there's a lot of interest socially to change regulations and to recycle fish in certain river systems. So we just want to sort out what's biologically feasible and what we could expect and what the expectations might be with the fishery with different bag limits. So not a lot to report there other than, stay tuned, and hopefully we'll continue to make progress on some information there. Other than that, stocking wise, nothing's really changed. We're back on track to stock our normal numbers in 2022, so in the spring. So we've got the fall fingerlings in the hatchery system now. I'm expecting that the yearlings will be on par for what we normally stock in numbers. We do have a reduced number of fall fingerlings due to some hatchery diseases that we have, especially at Wolf Lake State Fish Hatchery. So our fall fingerling stocking, which we've been experimenting with 300,000, maybe less this year. I'm just not sure how less that will be. All those fish are being marked now, and we'll get better numbers in terms of what we have remaining in the hatcheries after those mass markings done. I thought it was very interesting that with this slide, people wanting to do habitat restoration on their home river. So we are always anxious to hear about that. So we do have a funding program, a grant program for habitat improvement in our rivers. So we've got mechanisms to get things done. We're all about connectivity. So steelhead want to get to cold water. They want to get to gravelly habitat. And so the best way to open up that habitat is, road stream crossing projects, Putting in better culverts, putting in bridges, removing dams are all great ways to get more quality spawning habitat open to steelhead. So if you've got ideas or of people who own dams or communities that want to remove dams, get a hold of me or Mark Tonello's on. I think Heather's on. They're in some of the prime steelhead areas. So work with them and we'll see if we can improve some more habitat. So that's all I have for management. I think we're in an exciting place and, I'm just sitting on the edge of my seat waiting for these studies to be done. And, even with the mass marking, we missed a year, but, Matt was showing some really cool information that's coming out of that. So we are just kind of on that tipping point where we're going to learn a lot more, know a lot more about steelhead in the Great Lakes here in the next couple of years. That's all I got.
Thanks, Jay. And I'm just going to just open this up to questions now. If anyone's got any questions for Jay or me on anything that's been presented.